Thank you, Ricardo, for inviting me. I have to say I got a bit suspicious when you invited me to join this very prestigious panel. I mean, I'm the only non-cabinet member, basically, from the Bretton Woods institution, and I guess that what you are expecting is a bit of a dissenting voice, some kind of pessimistic view of the world, and I'll try not to disappoint on this one. What we heard so far was a list of great presentations of countries, understanding of structures and challenges, and what's going to happen next. But what I didn't hear, basically, and with all due respect, was a list of solutions and how we would go there. So my point here, and the point I will try to make in this presentation, is basically to try to show that while more data is definitely very, very important, and I think I completely applaud you for the work you've done on CID and bringing all of this data up, and governments actually hiring you to do this. I think that the sole focus on policy will not help solve the problem in the long term. So let me try to develop and explain why, if I manage to. Okay, here we go. So that's the pessimistic side to start with, right? So basically, GDP growth by region from 2003 to last year is declining. We've had some commodity-driven booms. It's gone down. Today, we're at 2 or 3%. People think it's a disaster. If you read Piketty, basically, you think that it's actually fantastic. The poverty headcount rate has gone down. The World Bank is clamoring all over the world that it's actually fantastic also. But yet, what we're seeing is that the Gini index, when you look at the large countries, is getting worse. So inequality is growing per country. And we've heard that actually from some of the speakers this morning already. The structural change has been limited in tough countries, in Africa, for instance. I mean, all of you, I'm sure, have read the article from Danny Roderick on this recently, last year, actually. We see the blue curve, which is growing, which is services, and then we see manufacturing, which is not doing so well down there. So we see that there is a problem there. And what Christine Lagarde is saying is that there is a new mediocre. And the problem appears to be much worse than before. So yesterday, the IMF released some data, some macro data, and what they say is that the forecast for next year is a growth of 3.2%. There is a contraction in Latin America, and a lot of you are from there. And in sub-Saharan Africa, the growth rate is going to be 3%, one of the lowest in the past decade, basically. A significant slowdown in China. And the commodity prices, nobody can see them can see how they're going to go up again. McKinsey Global Institute is also forecasting a 2.1% growth for the coming 50 years. That's pretty low as well. And the question I think I'd like to ask is, have policies around macro stability and economic diversification, have they been impactful enough or fast enough in that context? And I'd like to add another element to the complexity of the question, which is something that I hopefully will be able to talk about later this morning or this afternoon, is the urbanization factor. So while we see that actually manufacturing is not absorbing jobs, that's the curve, the blue curve there, we also see that there is a huge rush to cities. So we're going to have a lot of people, I'm looking at my friends in Africa, but a lot of people in South Asia as well, a lot of people sitting in cities having no jobs, basically. So what's going to happen there? So the problem is really, really tremendous today. And so what's the solutions? What are the solutions available to governments? And this is where I'll spend a little bit more time. I wanted to brush over the context very fast. When I go and meet with governments, and that's basically what I'm paid for. I travel around the world to do this, and not like Ricardo, but in a different manner. And I bring the pessimistic voice, and I'm the one who says, no, you can't do that. But basically, governments have two choices. They can get better at what they do, and we talked about this yesterday. We heard about this yesterday a little bit. So that's the better business environment, doing business that you all know about. That's the macro stability. Latin America has been very impressive in pushing this. That's a focus on some FDIs, attraction of FDIs, across the board, value chains and factor cost, some finance, and of course, some trade. I forgot the trade there. That's one option, right? And I call this basically the horizontal type of reforms, and you try to make the economy in general better. And that's what we heard this morning from the previous speakers on this panel. The other way is to try to generate a supply side response around in the economy. And that's what Ricardo has been pushing for many years, is the support to self-discovery, attraction of FDIs in certain sectors. We heard that also from some of our colleagues. And then there are some instruments that have been used around this. Agglomeration approaches to stimulate growth. I'm talking about zones, economic zones, and I'll come back to this. Growth poles, cities focus, clusters, and also some work on skill set development. And that's really the instrument. So I'm going to try now to decline what we heard before from government officials to what I'm seeing when I travel across the world, and I'm advising governments on this. What are the instruments actually at the hands of policymakers? And I'd like to come back first. I mean, I'd like to attack a little bit the horizontal reforms, because I'm not a big proponent of that. I mean, I think it's important, but not necessary. Not sufficient. I'd like to show you two charts. One which is basically about the doing business and the correlation of doing business with investment and with economic growth. That's the left-hand chart, basically non-correlated. There's a great paper by Lan Pritchett and one of my colleagues, Mary Hallward-Driemeyer, that was published, I think, last year, that shows that there's complete decorrelation. So a lot of political credit that governments use in trying to push doing business reforms are, again, very important, but are not necessarily translating into immediate results. So that's very important to understand when you advise governments. And when you try to move the productivity rates up by attacking the TFP and the factor conditions, as you can see in Africa, you have very modest type of improvements. You know, from 1990 to 2012, basically, access to electricity has been slow. I could show the same chart in South Asia or probably also in MENA as well. I'm not sure about Latin America, actually. So, you know, how do we generate the supply side response? And of course, what Ricardo has been doing, fantastic, you know, ask Harvard, basically. I mean, ask them which tree to jump on. So, you know, great charts, great data. I think, I mean, I love actually this information, and I read it a lot. I think it's fantastic. But concretely, I mean, once you know which tree to jump on, what are you going to do? How are you going to do this? And what I see is a list of 4 main instruments. It's always the same in all of the countries that I travel to. The first one I'll start with is the exchange rate policy. Obvious, right? I mean, you know better how to move that trigger. It's a complex one, so I'm not going to comment on it. But the 3 others are things that actually we're starting to study, and my team in the bank has tried to measure basically the impact of the 3 others. That's matching grants, special economic zones, and larger agglomeration approaches, which are the main you know, fashionable tools today. So let me share with you some of the results that we've gathered in looking at this recently. And I've put this chart, but actually I don't have to spend too much time because apparently my time is running out. Matching grants. What we did is that we looked at 66 programs over the past, I think, 20 years or so that have been implemented by governments. This represents billions of dollars of public money being thrown into the economy and trying to support the private sector. What we see, what is important here, is basically the central column here. And what you see is a balanced result. So the satisfactory ratings of this is balanced. You know, we have half of them which are negative, half of them which are positive. And we don't know why. We're trying to accumulate data. We're trying to run regressions. We're trying to have, you know, more variables added to the thing, to the analysis, and we can't get something better. My team has been working on this for a year and a half, basically, and we can't get anything more precise than this. Let me show another analysis that we've done, and that's on zones. And I'm looking at Minister Videgaray because I know that some of my team is actually working with you on this one. And the zones effectiveness. Well, there's a rumor today that actually doing economic zones is not a good thing to do, right? It's dangerous because you're going to lose your shirt. You're going to be able to throw a lot of money into infrastructure. You're going to feel good as a government official because, you know, it's actually, you can see some concrete results. But at the end of the day, maybe the zones are going to be empty. And we see this in a lot of countries. It takes time to take companies in, or at least to get the companies to join in. And I've looked at this, you know, in many countries around the world. What we've seen is that, you know, the pre-1995 results from the universe of zones that we have assessed, and you'll see that the universe is very small. It's only 25 zones because we cannot define zones in a homogeneous way. And we're running into huge issues around this. So anyway, before 1995, good success. After 1995, I'll come to the conclusion soon. After 1995, moderate success. And the reason why we have huge success before is because we used to be measuring zones based on the infrastructure output as opposed to looking at the impact of firms in the zones. The reality, when we look at the zones evaluation, and I've looked at them for more than 25 zones, obviously, the reality is much more complex than that, actually. You have zones that work, zones that don't work. And we don't know why. We cannot find the variable that actually tells us what makes it work, what doesn't make it work. So that's the second instrument that I'm talking about. The third one is growth polls. CGD, the Center for Global Development, issued a paper last year in analyzing the growth polls around the world. And the bank has basically ventured into this about 10 years ago, started up in Madagascar and tried to bring all of the sectors together and trying to define zones and trying to look at spatial growth and trying to put all of the incentives together in that area of one country, trying to see whether it could stimulate growth. That has worked somehow, but the results that we're having is that it's expensive. Sometimes it catches. I mean, we have great examples in Madagascar, in Burkina. I mean, two complex countries, and we've seen a lot of great successful examples in Western Europe as well, and also in East Asia. But in other places, not that much. Again, we cannot find the only or the single most important variable that tells us why it's working, why it's not working. I have 2 more slides, so please bear with me. So here is actually the punchline of my presentation. The instruments that ministers have at their hands is, basically the ones that I've listed, plus the public-private dialogue that actually we heard about from Peru, which I think is a fantastic way to understand exactly what the constraints are. But we're seeing that, in fact, we're not exactly sure what works, what doesn't work. And people like me going around and advising government, we don't exactly know what to say, actually. And I'm starting to wonder whether the issue is the right one. And the issue about, are we correct in engaging into structural transformation? Into industrial policy, new industrial policy, modern industrial policy, whatever the name is. Are we correct about this policy instrument? Maybe the question is not the right one. Maybe it's not about the policy. Maybe it's about the implementation. Maybe it's about the how. And that's why I was so interested in the presentation from Peru, because basically what you described was a mechanism where you're getting into a room with the private sector and you're asking them to give you feedback. Then you basically go into a recursive type of process, which has been tried and successfully implemented in Malaysia, for instance, through the Pemandu example. So maybe the question about matching grants is not whether it's good or bad to do matching grant. Maybe the question is how you put the matching grant together and how you implement it. Maybe the question about zones is not so much about whether it's good or bad. Maybe once you've made a decision to do the zone, the question is how will you make it and how will you define the instruments to go through this recursive approach, which will allow you to course correct as you're implementing your zones in the country. And I think this is the most critical factor. So as much as, as I love my own culture and being French, as you can hear, I'm obsessed also by policy, by ideas and by ideals. I think it's fantastic. But I'm starting to realize in my career and in my progression through this learning that I'm going through myself, that the real question is not so much the model, the ideal model or the image of a model. The real question is about how you're going to make it work. And that's very anti-French, frankly, to say this, and non-French. I'm not sure I would get a cabinet minister's appointment after that, but I think this is really where the question is. So in going forward, and I think that's why I was so excited to join this forum today, Ricardo, I think in going forward what we need to understand is what's the role of data to continue to inform the implementation side. Yes, it can inform policy, but the real question is not so much the policy side, probably or maybe as importantly, it's the implementation side of the policy. Thank you very much.